Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know how we do things here. We take a fascinating topic. For today, it's Latin American feminism, and we really try to, well, dive deep
Ecodig's right.
into the source material. And today's deep dive is, well, it's especially interesting because we're not just looking at the history of feminism in Latin America,
Right.
but at how these women throughout history have acted as philosophers. I mean, really questioning the world around them, grappling with the big questions, offering new ways of understanding power and identity and justice.
It's a really great point. And I think it's something that often gets missed in more conventional histories of feminism. We tend to focus on the social and political movements, which are obviously hugely important, but sometimes we lose sight of the deep philosophical underpinnings of those movements.
Yeah, it's like we forget that these women were also thinkers engaging with the same fundamental questions that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Like, what does it mean to be human? What is a just society? How do we know what we know?
Exactly. And what makes it even more fascinating is that they were doing this in really specific contexts, right? Facing incredible social and political pressures, often grappling with the legacies of colonialism and patriarchy. So their philosophical insights are really powerful because they emerge from these really lived experiences of struggle and resistance.
It's like their philosophy is born out of necessity. It's not just abstract theorizing. It's about making sense of the world in order to change it.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you've provided me with a really excellent resource, the entry on Latin American feminism from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
It really lays out the whole development of feminist thought in the region, from its historical roots all the way to the debates that are still shaping our understanding of these issues today.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a comprehensive overview, and I think our mission for this deep dive is to uncover those core philosophical ideas and debates within Latin American feminism, and to really show our listeners how these women acted as philosophers. Like, how did they analyze and critique the world around them, and what alternative perspectives did they offer?
That sounds great. I'm ready to dive in.
So let's start at the beginning. Where do we even begin to see this philosophical engagement taking root? Like when and where does this story really begin?
Okay, well, I think a good place to start is by challenging the traditional timeline of Latin American feminist philosophy.
Okay.
Often you hear that it really began in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of the second wave feminist movement globally.
Mm.
But I think it's crucial to recognize that the philosophical roots of Latin American feminism actually run much deeper.
So where would you say those roots lie?
Well, I think we can trace them back to early reflections on otherness,
Otherness.
that feeling of being marginalized or different. And that really emerged directly from the colonial experience in Latin America.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, colonialism was all about creating hierarchies and divisions.
Exactly. So you have this imposition of European culture and values, and a really deliberate effort to subjugate and erase indigenous and African cultures.
Yeah.
And women within those cultures faced a double layer of oppression because they were also subject to patriarchal norms and structures.
Yeah, so they're already seen as other within their own societies, and then colonialism comes in and kind of reinforces and exacerbates that otherness.
Precisely. And this experience of being other, I think, really pushed women to question the dominant systems of thought, the categories and assumptions that were being used to define their reality. And that's where we start to see the seeds of a philosophical critique taking root.
So, like, from the very beginning, they're already challenging the way the world is being defined and who gets to do the defining.
Exactly. And another really crucial aspect of this early intellectual work was the effort to recover women's history and to acknowledge their contributions to knowledge production.
I mean, that's huge, right? Because history has so often been written from the perspective of the colonizers and the victors.
It has, and it's often left women out of the narrative completely, or relegated them to very, very limited roles.
Yeah, it's like their stories, their experiences, their knowledge has been systematically silenced and erased.
Exactly. So part of this early feminist project was to unearth those silent stories, to reclaim those lost voices, and to demonstrate that women have always been active participants in shaping history and knowledge.
And that involved focusing on areas that traditional philosophy often ignored, right? Like the body sexuality systems of oppression, things like that.
Absolutely, because these are the areas where women's lives were most directly impacted by these systems of power. So for them to understand their own reality, they needed to develop new ways of thinking about these fundamental aspects of human experience.
It makes me think about how we talk about the personal being political, right?
It does. And that connection is really central to Latin American feminism from the very beginning. It's the understanding that our personal experiences, our bodies, our relationships, our families, all of these things are shaped by these broader social and political forces.
Right. So it's not just about individual choices or preferences. It's about recognizing how those choices are always constrained and shaped by the systems we live in.
Precisely. Now, one of the challenges we face when we try to trace this early history of feminist thought is that the written historical record is often incomplete, especially when we're talking about non-white women in the 19th century and
Yeah,
earlier.
that's a huge point. Like whose knowledge is valued and preserved, right?
Absolutely. And literacy rates were lower among women of color, particularly those who were enslaved or living in poverty,
Mm-hmm.
and textual documentation was much more scarce.
So how do we even begin to reconstruct their philosophical contributions if we don't have those written records?
Well, that's where the source reminds us of the crucial role of oral traditions.
Ah, okay. So things like songs, myths, proverbs.
Exactly. Because these forms of cultural expression often served as repositories of knowledge and wisdom that were passed down through generations.
And they weren't just stories, right? They carried deeper philosophical meaning.
Right. Take, for example, Beruunda, the wife of the Garifuna leader Setuye. Her resistance against colonialism in Central America is woven into the songs that Garifuna women in Honduras and Belize still sing today.
Wow. So her story, her philosophy is kept alive through music.
Exactly. And it's not just about preserving the past, right? These songs are also a way of transmitting values and ideas to future generations. They're a form of philosophical reflection embedded in cultural expression.
That's really beautiful. And there are other examples like that, right?
There are. Another really striking example is Anacaona, the Tenino chief of Jaragua in Hispaniola. Her defiance against the Spanish colonizers lives on in songs that are still sung across the Caribbean.
So even though we might not have written texts from these women, their ideas, their philosophies are still present and powerful in these other forms of expression.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have documented figures like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 17th century.
Oh, yes, Sor Juana, she's really a pivotal figure in Latin American history and literature.
She is. And her very existence as a self-educated scholar, a woman who dedicated her life to intellectual pursuits in that era, it was a profound philosophical statement.
Like her life itself was an act of resistance.
It was. And she didn't shy away from directly challenging the limitations that were placed on women. She argued passionately for women's rights to education and intellectual pursuits. And her writings have received a lot of attention from philosophers, and she's now recognized as a really significant figure within the Latin American philosophical canon.
So she's like reclaiming the right for women to be philosophers.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that, while she was celebrated in her own time, her work later fell into relative obscurity before being rediscovered in the mid-20th century.
And that rediscovery itself is really telling, right?
It is. It reminds us of how historical memory can be shaped by societal biases and the ongoing need to reclaim marginalized voices.
So it becomes this kind of feminist act, right?
Yeah.
To rediscover her and to bring her back into the philosophical conversation.
Precisely. It's about challenging the established philosophical lineage, the one that's so often dominated by men and European perspectives.
Yeah, it's like saying, hey, there's this whole other tradition of philosophical thought that's been ignored and silenced, and we need to bring it back into the light.
Exactly. And sort of one is a really powerful symbol of that reclaiming of intellectual history.
So moving beyond Sor Juana the Source introduces a whole range of other early figures who were grappling with these philosophical questions. Can you give us a sense of their diverse contributions?
I can. I mean, it's really remarkable the array of thinkers and activists who are emerging across the region, each engaging with these philosophical questions through the very specific lens of their own lived experiences.
And their concerns were really diverse, right?
They were. I mean, in 18th century Brazil, you have Teresa Margarida da Silva y Horta, who argued for the autonomy of indigenous peoples and women's inclusion in scientific inquiry. In 19th century Peru, you have Flora Tristan, who connected the struggle for women's equality to the fight for workers' rights.
Okay, so already we're seeing this intersectional understanding of oppression.
Exactly. And in Argentina, you have Juana Manso, who saw education as the key to women's emancipation. Rita Cetina Gutierrez in Mexico championed secular education and self-determination for women.
So they're really challenging the traditional roles that were assigned to women, the limitations that were placed on their lives.
They are, and they're doing it in a really different context, right?
Mhm.
I mean, Visitación Padilla in Honduras, for example, she fought for access to education and against U.S. intervention.
Wow, so she's linking these local struggles to these global power dynamics.
Exactly. And in Venezuela, you have Teresa de la Parra, who used her literary voice to question the restrictive norms of gender roles.
Okay, so they're really using all the tools at their disposal to make their arguments to challenge the status quo.
They are. And what's really striking is how many of these early feminist ideas were deeply rooted in personal experience.
Okay, so back to that idea of the personal being political.
Exactly. It's like this recognition that our personal experiences aren't just private matters. They're shaped by these broader systems of power. And to understand those systems, we need to start with our own lives, our own stories.
Right, it's like saying, hey, my experience as a woman in this society is not just about me, it's about something much bigger than me.
Precisely. And that's why I think it's so important to recover these early voices, to understand the philosophical roots of Latin American feminism,
Mm.
because they lay the groundwork for a lot of the ideas and debates that are still shaping the movement today.
And as these early ideas were rediscovered during the 20th century feminist movements, it must have really prompted some fundamental reevaluations.
It did. The rediscovery of these thinkers and their ideas, it forced a reexamination of how we understand women, how we understand history, and even the very nature of knowledge itself.
Like it's like saying, hold on, we've been telling the story wrong this whole time.
Exactly.
Huh.
Because the dominant historical narrative, the one that's centered on men and European perspectives,
Yeah.
it just completely erases the contributions of women, especially women of color.
So it's not just about adding women back into the story, it's about recognizing that the story itself is flawed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the philosophical work becomes really important. It's about developing new ways of thinking about history, about knowledge, about the very categories that we use to make sense of the world.
So it's not just about recovering lost voices, it's about rethinking the whole system.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's a really crucial part of the legacy of Latin American feminism.
Okay, so moving into the early 20th century, the source emphasizes this transnational flow of feminist ideas. How did this exchange shape philosophical thought in the region?
Well, I think during this period, you really see feminist ideas circulating across borders and often becoming deeply intertwined with other movements for social change.
So it's not just a feminist movement, it's part of a broader push for justice and equality.
Exactly. And women's concerns about justice and equality and political participation, they frequently converged with the struggles of the poor working class, for example.
Okay, so these women are seeing the connections between different forms of oppression.
They are.
Okay.
And they're starting to develop these more holistic understandings of how power operates in society.
And the source highlights the Mexican Revolution as a really key moment in this evolution.
It was. I mean, the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, had a profound impact on feminist thought, particularly around education and women's political activism.
Okay, so how did that play out specifically?
Well, for one thing, you have the feminist congresses
Yeah.
that were held in Merida in 1916.
Yeah.
These were groundbreaking events. I mean, they brought together women from all over Mexico to discuss things like the right to vote, political participation, abortion, contraception, education, all of these really crucial issues.
Wow, so they're really starting to articulate a clear feminist agenda.
There are. And by 1923, women were even elected as deputies in Yucatan.
Yeah.
So you can really see how these philosophical ideas, these discussions about women's rights, they're starting to translate into real political action.
So it's not just talk, it's actually changing the political landscape.
Exactly. And I think this is a really important thread that we see throughout the history of Latin American feminism.
Yeah.
This constant questioning of dominant categories and the insistence on centering marginalized experiences.
It's like they're always pushing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable or even thinkable.
They are. And that's what makes their contributions so significant.
So this wasn't just happening in Mexico, right?
No, not at all. This was a really widespread phenomenon.
Yeah.
The source gives all these fascinating examples of feminist activism and emerging ideas from all across Latin America and the Caribbean during this time.
So give us some examples.
Well, in Brazil, you have abolitionist newspapers that are advocating for all sorts of social changes, including challenging traditional dress norms.
Okay, so they're really taking on these deeply ingrained cultural practices.
They are. And in Argentina in 1910, They host the first Feminist International Congress.
Wow. So this is becoming a truly international movement.
It is, and they're pushing for things like peace education, women's greater social participation.
So they're linking the fight for women's rights to these broader global issues.
Exactly. And you see similar things happening in other countries. In Colombia, women are actively defending the civil rights of married women. In Panama, you have women's clubs that are focused on intellectual and physical education as well as political engagement.
So they're really creating these spaces for women to learn and grow and to connect with each other.
They are. And it's not just about self-improvement, right? They're also using these spaces to organize and to advocate for social change.
Right. So it's about personal empowerment, but also collective action.
Exactly. And I think Visitation Padilla in Honduras is a really great example of this. She bravely denounced U.S. military intervention in her country.
So she's really connecting these local struggles to these broader global power dynamics.
Exactly. And women in Ecuador, they actually sued the state for the right to vote, and they achieved that milestone in 1929.
Wow, that's incredible. So they're really using the legal system to fight for their rights.
They are. And I think all of these examples, they really paint a picture of this widespread feminist consciousness, this desire for fundamental change that's sweeping across the region.
Yeah, it's like a fire that's been ignited and it's just spreading and spreading.
Exactly. And this is all happening before the so-called second wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s.
Right. So this is really laying the groundwork for what comes later.
Precisely.
Okay, so the source then focuses on Luisa Capetillo in Puerto Rico as a particularly insightful example of this convergence of feminist ideas with broader visions of social transformation. What makes her contributions so significant?
I'm glad you brought her up. Luisa Capetillo is such a fascinating figure.
Yeah, I mean, she really embodies this spirit of radical change.
She does. And I think her story really highlights the importance of intersectionality.
Okay, explain that.
So she was working as a reader in cigar factories in Puerto Rico.
A reader.
Yes, so she would read aloud to the workers while they were rolling cigars.
Wow. Okay, so it's like an early form of podcasting.
Kind of. And through this role, she was exposed to all these different ideas about labor rights, socialism, anarchism, and of course, women's rights.
So she's like this conduit for radical thought.
She is. And she starts to see the connections between all these different struggles, right? How the exploitation of workers is connected to the oppression of women. How both of these things are rooted in these broader systems of power.
Okay, so it's not just about fighting for one cause. It's about understanding how all these different causes are interconnected.
Exactly. And that's where her feminist anarchism comes in.
Feminist anarchism, what does that mean?
Well, it's basically the idea that true liberation requires the dismantling of all forms of hierarchy and domination. So it's not just about getting rid of the state. It's about dismantling patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, all of these interlocking systems of oppression.
Okay, so it's a really radical vision of social transformation.
It is, and Capetillo was really ahead of her time in a lot of ways. She was advocating for things like free love and women's control over their own bodies way back in the early 20th century.
Wow, so she's really pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable or even thinkable at the time.
She is, and that's what makes her work so important. She's helping to lay the foundation for a more radical and intersectional understanding of feminism.
Okay, so we've talked about these early feminist thinkers and activists who are really challenging the status quo. But the source also mentions the women's suffrage movement, which spanned from 1870 to 1947. It's important to remember, as the source emphasizes, that this period was about far more than just gaining the right to vote.
That's right. It's important to remember that the fight for women's suffrage, it was really embedded in this broader struggle for women's rights and equality.
Okay, so it wasn't just about getting a seat at the table. It was about changing the whole table.
Exactly. It was about transforming the very structures of power that were keeping women marginalized and oppressed.
And that involved a whole range of different issues. Right?
It did. I mean, education was a huge one. Women were fighting for equal access to education, for the right to pursue higher education, for the right to have their intellectual contributions recognized and respected.
Okay, so it's about challenging the idea that women's minds are somehow inferior or less capable than men's.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing the value of women's knowledge and experiences.
Right, because if you're only educating men, then you're only getting half the story.
Precisely. And the suffrage movement was also closely linked to the fight for economic justice.
Okay, so how did that connection play out?
Well, for one thing, women were fighting for the right to own property
Yeah.
and to control their own finances.
Okay, so challenging the idea that women are financially dependent on men.
Exactly. And they were also fighting for fair wages and decent working conditions.
So connecting the struggle for women's rights to the broader labor movement.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of peace.
Peace.
Yes, I mean, women were often at the forefront of anti-war movements.
Okay, so challenging the idea that war is somehow a masculine pursuit.
Precisely. And they were pointing out the devastating impact of war on women and children, on families and communities.
Right, because war is never just about the soldiers on the battlefield. It affects everyone.
Exactly. So the suffrage movement was really about so much more than just the right to vote.
It was about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to remember that this movement was deeply philosophical as well as political.
Okay, so within this context of the suffrage movement, the source mentions this Uruguayan philosopher, Carlos Vaz Ferreira. It's interesting to see a male philosopher engaging with feminist ideas relatively early on.
It is. And his treatise, Sobre Feminismo, which he published in 1933, it's actually a really fascinating read.
Okay, so what are some of his key arguments?
Well, he develops this concept of a feminism of compensation.
Feminism of compensation, what does that mean?
Well, basically, he argues that women might face certain biological disadvantages compared to men,
Okay.
but that society has a responsibility to compensate for these disadvantages through adjustment in our laws and institutions.
Okay, interesting. So give me an example.
Well, he talks about suffrage, for instance. He says that women should have the right to vote because it's the only way to ensure that their interests are represented in government.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he also talks about education. He says that women need access to quality education in order to develop their intellectual capacities and to participate fully in society.
Okay, so he's not just talking about equality in the abstract. He's actually proposing concrete policy changes.
He is. And he even talks about divorce, which was a pretty radical idea at the time.
Yeah, definitely.
He says that women should have the right to divorce if they're in an unhappy or abusive marriage.
Okay, so he's really challenging the traditional patriarchal view of marriage.
He is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, while Vaz Ferreira's perspective might not align perfectly with later feminist thought, it's still significant that he was engaging with these issues at all.
Right, it shows that the conversation around women's roles and rights was starting to enter broader intellectual circles, even if the framework wasn't always what we would consider feminist today.
Exactly. It's a sign of the times.
Okay, so moving on from Vaz Ferreira, the source then talks about these years of silence between 1950 and 1970. Given all the activism we've already discussed, this term seems pretty striking. What was happening during this period?
Yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer, I think, because it wasn't really silent at all.
Okay, so what's going on?
Well, it's a really complex period. You have the rise of populism in many parts of Latin America, the Cold War, and the increasing influence of the United States in the region.
Okay, and how does that impact feminist activism?
Well, in some ways, it actually leads to greater political participation for women.
Okay, how so?
Well, they're joining popular social movements, they're getting involved in political parties, they're organizing in their communities.
Okay, but they're not necessarily doing it under the banner of feminism.
Right, because the term feminism, it becomes kind of associated with bourgeois white women in some circles.
Okay, so there's this sense that feminism is not really relevant to the struggles of working class women or women of color.
Right. And there's also this fear of being labeled as a communist or a socialist.
Oh, right, because this is the height of the Cold War.
Exactly. So it's a very politically charged environment.
Okay, so women are still active, but they're maybe not as explicitly feminist in their demands.
Right. But that doesn't mean that they're not still grappling with these philosophical questions about gender and power and identity.
Okay, so how are they doing that?
Well, one of the things that the source points out is that there's this incredible flourishing of women's writing during this period.
Okay, so they're expressing their ideas through literature rather than through political treatises or philosophical essays.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that in Latin America, there's always been this really strong connection between literature and philosophy.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, literature has always been a way of exploring these big questions about life and society and the human condition.
It has. And women writers in the mid-20th century, they were writing extensively about their experiences and their perspectives on the world, often in very subtle and nuanced ways.
So they're not necessarily saying I'm a feminist or this is a feminist text, but they're still engaging with these feminist ideas.
Exactly. And I think their contributions were sometimes undervalued precisely because they were expressed through literature rather than in these more traditional academic forms.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, right? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Right. If these women are writing these brilliant texts, but they're not being read by philosophers or political theorists, then are they really contributing to the philosophical conversation?
So it's a question of who gets to define what counts as philosophy.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the challenges that Latin American feminist philosophy has always faced. It's this struggle to be recognized as a legitimate field of inquiry.
Right,
Yeah.
because it's often seen as too interdisciplinary, too connected to social and political movements, too grounded in lived experience.
Exactly. And that's a shame because there's so much richness and depth to this tradition of thought.
Okay, so even within this literary context, were women's writings entirely removed from questions of power and social change?
No, not at all. I mean, while not all of these texts were explicitly political, many of them did express doubts and resistances and challenges to the prevailing patriarchal order.
Okay, so give me an example.
Well, the source highlights Rosario Castellanos of Mexico as a key example. And she's actually a really interesting case because she actually did write a master's thesis in philosophy in 1950 titled Sobre Cultura Femenina, which explored women's role in the production of culture.
Okay, so she was engaging with philosophy in a more traditional academic way.
She was, but she's best known for her literary work, her poetry and novels.
And her later work is often seen as being very rich in philosophical and theoretical insights, right?
It is, particularly her novel El Eterno Femenino, which was published posthumously in 1974.
Okay, so what are some of the key themes she explores in that work?
Well, it's a really complex and multi-layered novel, but some of the key themes are gender, ethnicity, nationhood, and really the challenges of creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so she's really connecting these personal experiences of being a woman in Mexico to these broader political and social issues.
Exactly. And she's doing it in a way that's both intellectually rigorous and deeply moving.
So even during this so-called silent period, there are these thinkers who are grappling with these fundamental philosophical questions about women's roles and identities, even if their work wasn't always categorized as philosophy at the time.
Exactly. And Castellanos wasn't the only one.
Okay, so who are some other writers from this period who are worth checking out?
Well, the source mentions a few others,
Hmm.
including Antonia Palacios in Venezuela, Alba Lucia Ancel in Colombia, and Ricardo Ochoa in Mexico, and Marvel Moreno in Colombia.
Okay, so these are all women who are using their literary voices to to challenge the status quo, to explore these complex questions about gender and power and identity.
They are. And I think their work really demonstrates the power of literature
Mhm.
to make us think differently, to see the world from new perspectives.
Okay, so let's move on now to the later 20th century, the 1970s through the 1990s, which the source describes as the ideas of a movement. This sounds like a period of significant social and political transformation for women.
It was. I mean, this is when you really see the emergence of a more organized and vocal feminist movement in Latin America.
Okay, so what are some of the key factors that are driving this movement?
Well, I think there are a few things going on. For one thing, you have the global rise of the second wave feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
And that's definitely having an impact in Latin America.
Okay, so there's this sense of solidarity with women in other parts of the world who are fighting for similar rights.
Exactly. And you also have all these political and social upheavals happening in Latin America itself.
Okay, so give me some examples.
You have the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which really inspires a lot of leftist movements across the region.
Right.
You have the rise of military dictatorships in many countries.
Oh, right.
You have the civil wars in Central America.
This is a really turbulent time.
It is. And within this context, women are starting to organize and to mobilize and to demand change.
Okay, and what are some of their key demands?
Well, they're fighting for a whole range of things. Reproductive rights, access to education, equal pay, and end to violence against women.
So they're really taking on the whole system of patriarchy.
They are. And they're doing it in a way that's both radical and pragmatic.
Go explain that.
So on the one hand, they're challenging the very foundations of gender roles and power relations.
Okay.
But on the other hand, they're also working within existing systems to make concrete changes, to to improve women's lives in the here and now.
So it's about both long-term vision and short-term action.
Exactly. And I think this is a really key characteristic of Latin American feminism. It's this ability to hold these multiple perspectives at the same time.
Okay, so the source describes this period as being marked by the flourishing of diverse feminist ideas, often referred to as neo-feminism, with a particular emphasis on the body as a site of both oppression and resistance.
Right. I think that's a really important point because in many ways, this is when the focus on the body really comes to the forefront of feminist thought in Latin America.
Okay, so how does that play out specifically?
Well, for one thing, there's this really powerful politicization of motherhood.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, on the one hand, you have groups like Comadres in El Salvador and Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina.
Oh, right. These are the mothers who are protesting the disappearance of their children during the dirty wars.
Exactly. And they're using motherhood, this traditionally feminine role, to challenge state power, to demand justice for their families.
So they're turning this symbol of domesticity into a symbol of resistance.
Exactly. And it's incredibly powerful. I mean, these women are risking their lives to speak out against these brutal regimes.
Yeah, it's really inspiring.
It is. But at the same time, you also have these neo-feminist groups like MAS
Yeah.
in Mexico who are critiquing the idealized and often oppressive myth of motherhood.
Okay, so they're saying that not all women are mothers and that motherhood shouldn't be seen as the defining characteristic of womanhood.
Exactly. And they're arguing for a clear separation between motherhood and the broader category of womanhood.
Okay, so there's this tension within the feminist movement between these different understandings of motherhood.
There is.
Yeah.
And I think it reflects the diversity of women's experiences, right? Some women embrace motherhood while others reject it. And both of those choices are valid.
Right, so it's not about imposing a single model of womanhood on everyone.
Exactly. And this period also sees the rise of demands for the decriminalization of abortion and the recognition of reproductive rights based on women's individual autonomy.
Okay, so this is a really crucial issue.
It is. And
Mhm.
it's one that's still being hotly debated in Latin America today.
Yeah, I mean, the legal status of abortion varies widely across the region.
It does. And